There's a kind of silence that only happens above 9,000 feet, when the wind quits and the timber stops creaking, and every animal in earshot decides at the same moment to stop breathing. I call it listening silence. Not because the forest is quiet, because it's listening back. That's the silence I was standing in when the receiver pinged. Wrong frequency. Not by a little. A channel that had no business showing activity, not on my assigned grid, not on any grid I'd loaded that morning. My GPS unit sat cold in my palm, screen glow lighting the fog of my own breath in slow pulses. The blip on the tracking screen drifted in a pattern I'd have called skip lag on any other night. A stutter, a correction, a stutter again. Except there was nothing to correct against. I stood there. I didn't move. I just watched the dot. 11 winters in the Bitterroot teaches you that the dot on a screen is never the strange part. It's what you do next that matters. I've worked wolf livestock conflict and pack monitoring across 3 districts for USDA Wildlife Services since I was 26, and in that time I've learned to read snow the way some people read weather fronts. 2 winters ago, when a depredating pack had 2 biologists before me stumped and a rancher threatening to start shooting collars off wolves himself, I tracked that pack through 40 inches of fresh powder using nothing but stride spacing math, gait length, depth, drift angle. Found the den in 11 hours. Closed the case in a week. I tell you that so you understand, I don't spook easy and I don't imagine things. But I'll admit 2 habits I've never fully explained, not even to myself. My supervisor likes to joke that I carry twice the flares regulation requires, ever since 2 seasons ago, though I couldn't tell you exactly why I started. And like every tracker who's worked the upper drainage long enough, I follow an unofficial rule nobody put in writing. You don't work that basin alone past last light. Nobody taught me that rule. I just always knew to keep it. That morning, none of it felt like the start of anything. It felt like Tuesday. The assignment was a seasonal battery sweep for collared wolves in the upper drainage, the kind of task I've done so many times I could do it half asleep. I had my receiver, 2 spare battery packs, snowshoes strapped to my pack, and a printout of the 4 frequencies I was listening for that day. 151.220, 151.460, 151.680, and 151.900, each one tagged to a specific wolf I'd collared myself over the past 2 seasons. Nothing exotic. Nothing that should have required more than 6 hours and a thermos of bad coffee. The route ran up along the creek bottom before climbing into the timber, the same line I'd walked a dozen times that winter alone. What I noted and didn't think much of at the time was the quiet. 3 weeks without a single logged howl. No depredation reports, no kill sites flagged by the rancher's downslope, nothing on the receiver but battery telemetry, steady and dull. Den season does that. Pairs go quiet, conserve energy, stop announcing themselves to anything that might be listening. I'd seen it before. I wrote it down as exactly that and kept walking. Then I found tracks. Fresh ones, maybe an hour old judging by the crispness of the edges, cutting straight across a clearing at the base of a deadfall slope. Clean 4-toe prints, claw marks registering ahead of the pads exactly the way they should. Textbook, the kind of track I'd use to train a new hire. I crouched to measure stride length out of habit, tape pulled taut between heel strikes, and the number didn't sit right. The stride was long. Too long for how shallow the impression sat in the snow. A wolf moving that fast, covering that much ground per step, should have been punching down harder, not floating across the surface like it barely touched it. I filed it away. Cold fingers, I told myself. Bad measurement. I kept walking. I told myself the cold was making me sloppy. So I knelt down and did it properly. I cleared snow from around the print with my glove, exposing the full impression down to the crust layer, and ran the numbers again, slower this time. Stride length, 61 inches. For a track that long, moving at that gait, you need mass driving down into the substrate. I'd put a healthy adult wolf at roughly 90 to 100 pounds, and a stride that size should have punched a depth 3 times what I was looking at. This print sat barely a half-inch into the snowpack. Like something had covered that ground without committing its full weight to a single step. I checked for the obvious explanation first, because that's the job. Rule out the mundane before you let yourself reach for anything else. An injured wolf, favoring a leg, might lengthen stride on one side and drag on the other. I looked for drag marks. Nothing. No scuff trailing off the rear of any print, no asymmetry between left and right, no sign of a limp compensating for pain. Then I did something I don't normally bother with on a routine sweep. I measured the spacing between 5 consecutive prints, then 10, then walked the line and measured another 15 beyond that. 61 inches. Every single time. Not 60, not 62. 61, repeated down the line like someone had stamped it. Living things don't move like that. A wolf's stride shifts constantly, terrain, fatigue, a shift in attention, the smallest hitch in breath changes the next footfall by a centimeter or 2, sometimes more. That variation isn't sloppiness. It's what a living body does. A perfect, unchanging interval, over and over, belongs to something mechanical. A pendulum, not an animal. I stood there a moment with my glove still resting near the print, and told myself, out loud, that my hands were numb and my tape measure was old and stretched and probably reading short. That cold makes you second-guess your own instruments. I've seen it happen to better trackers than me. So I kept walking. But I pulled my GPS unit out anyway and marked the coordinates, tagging it with a note I'd later be glad I bothered to type. Anomalous track, verify. Just in case. I told myself it was nothing. I didn't believe it even then. By the time I'd walked another quarter mile, I'd built myself a theory I actually liked. Bears. Specifically, an injured bear, and I had precedent. 2 winters back, a boar with advanced mange had left a trail through Sula that looked almost alien, gait thrown so far off by skin damage and nerve pain that another tracker had radioed it in as unidentified, possibly diseased canid. I'd seen the photos myself. Strange tracks aren't always strange animals. Sometimes they're just animals in pain, compensating in ways their bodies were never built to compensate. It fit well enough that my pulse actually slowed down. A bear coming out of a partial den-up, maybe arthritic, maybe favoring a damaged limb from a fight or a fall, could absolutely produce an irregular gait that read wrong to someone expecting wolf sign. I told myself that, walked the theory out loud the way I do when I'm building a field report in my head, paragraph by paragraph, calm and procedural. Then I found the second set. A half-mile up, same drainage, same crisp, shallow-pressed prints, same 61-inch spacing, and for 1 good minute, that felt like confirmation instead of contradiction. An injured animal moves consistently within its own injury. The same bad leg favors itself the same way every time. That's not anomalous. That's just damage repeating. I almost let myself believe it. Then the trail crossed a downed lodgepole, maybe 16 inches in diameter, half buried under crusted snow, the kind of obstacle that forces every 4-legged animal alive to do something. Shift weight. Hesitate. Scrabble a back leg for purchase on the bark. Even a healthy bear breaks stride crossing deadfall that size. An injured one breaks it worse. I've seen the scuff marks, the gouges where claws dig in trying to compensate for a leg that won't bear weight. There was nothing. The tracks crossed that log at a dead straight angle, same spacing before and after, no scuff on the bark, no compression where a paw should have dug in to clear the obstacle, no shift in stride to account for the change in elevation. It crossed that log the way a thought crosses a sentence. Like the log wasn't there. My technical voice kept working anyway, because that's what 11 years trains into you. I noted the absence of disturbance, the unbroken interval, cataloged it the way I'd catalog anything else. Dry and procedural, this doesn't match known Ursid gait patterns. Recommend? Recommend what? Underneath that voice, something faster and uglier was running its own commentary, and it wasn't using sentences anymore. It was just noticing things. How still the trees were. How my own breathing was the only sound left in that whole stretch of timber. How the light had gone the particular flat gray that comes right before a basin loses the sun for good. I reached for my radio out of pure reflex, the kind of motion you don't decide to make, just to hear another human frequency exist somewhere in the world. It crackled once, half a second of static, and underneath it, barely there, something that sounded almost, not quite, but almost like my own voice, reading back a set of coordinates I hadn't said out loud. I keyed the radio and waited for the kind of answer that would let me laugh this off and keep walking. Dispatch, this is Renner, Upper Bitterroot Drainage. Got some anomalous track sign I want logged, and my radio just threw some static I'd call unusual. Can you confirm the channel's clean on your end? The pause that came back was half a second too long. I know what a clean transmission delay sounds like after 11 years on this radio. This wasn't that. Copy, Renner. Probably equipment interference. That drainage throws a lot of it, terrain, mineral deposits, you know how it gets up there. I'd heard that line before from other people about other things and never once had reason to question it. So I pushed just a little. Anything specific I should know about? Has anyone else logged interference in that exact basin? Another pause. Shorter, but worse because this one had a decision sitting inside it. There've been a couple reports. Phantom collar pings, 2 trackers, over the last 2 years. Both got written up as hardware malfunction. Receiver glitches. Nothing confirmed beyond that. Nothing I'd ever heard mentioned in a single briefing. Not once, not in passing, not in any safety memo I'd been handed in 11 years of working that grid. Who logged the last one? I asked. The dispatcher's voice tightened in a way that had nothing to do with radio static. That'd be Halvorsen. He transferred districts not long after. Paperwork's probably still in the system if you want to dig for it. Transferred districts. Said fast, said flat, said like a door being shut gently enough that you're not supposed to notice it closing. I didn't push harder. I'm not sure why. Maybe because some part of me already understood that whatever answer came next wasn't going to be one dispatch could give me over an open channel, standing in an office 40 miles away with heat and coffee and 4 solid walls between them and this drainage. Copy that, I said. I'll log it and keep moving. Stay safe out there, Renner. I clipped the radio back to my chest strap and looked down at my GPS to mark the time on my anomaly log, a habit so automatic I do it without thinking. The clock read 3:47. I'd checked it not 10 minutes earlier, right before keying the radio, and it had read 3:51. I stood there doing the kind of math that shouldn't take this long. For minutes. Gone backward. Not frozen, not glitched into static digits, actually reading earlier than it had read before, like time itself had taken one step back and forgotten to mention it. I tapped the screen. Hit the reset toggle. Watched the seconds tick forward normally again, 3:47 and 11, 12, 13, perfectly steady, as if nothing had happened at all. I had maybe 2 hours of usable light left in that drainage by my last reliable estimate. I no longer trusted that estimate. I gave myself one job after that: trust the equipment, not the feeling. So I checked the equipment. The position marker on my GPS started drifting almost immediately, sliding off the track line by 10, 15, then 30 yards, showing me standing in 2 places at once on a screen that's never once lied to me in 11 years of fieldwork. I've worked enough steep, mineral-heavy canyons to know dead zones exist. Satellite geometry gets ugly fast in terrain like this: walls of rock cutting off half the sky, signal bouncing instead of arriving clean. That's a real phenomenon. That's not paranoia. That's physics. So I told myself, canyon interference, old hardware, nothing more sinister than a unit that's taken one too many cold nights in my pack. Then the battery dropped. 80% to 12 in under 10 minutes. With a cold weather pack rated to outperform exactly this kind of temperature, a pack I'd tested myself at the start of the season specifically because I don't trust factory specs in real Montana cold. That drain wasn't gradual. It wasn't a slope. It was a cliff. I stepped back from the track line, off to the side, just to put fresh eyes on the screen. The battery percentage stopped falling. I stood there a second, then stepped forward again, back onto the line of those 61-inch strides, close enough to the nearest print that my boots sat almost level with it. The number dropped again. 11%. I stepped off. It stopped. That's rung 2 gone, clean and total, no soft landing on it at all. This was never terrain. Terrain doesn't care where your boots are standing. Terrain doesn't turn off the moment you step 6 feet to the left. Whatever was draining that battery was doing it on purpose, tethered to those tracks specifically, and it had been doing it the entire time I'd been measuring, photographing, kneeling close enough to touch. My radio range told its own story underneath all of this, one I'd been too distracted to add up properly. Dispatch had come through clear that morning at the trailhead. By midday, garbled. Now, attempting a check-in just to hear a human voice, I got nothing but a long, open hiss, the kind of silence a radio makes when it's transmitting into nothing at all. Elevation gain alone doesn't account for that kind of range collapse, not in a drainage this size, not over the course of one afternoon. I was losing tools faster than I could replace my trust in them. I pulled my paper map instead, the backup I carry specifically for days when electronics fail, and traced my position against an old structure marked from a decade-old district survey, a line shack, maybe half a mile further up the drainage, used by trail crews back before most of this land got reassigned to satellite monitoring instead of foot patrols. It wasn't much of a plan. Walls. A door that closes. Somewhere to sit down, breathe, and figure out what I was actually looking at before the light went completely. I told myself that's all it was. Shelter. A pause button. I started walking toward it anyway, faster than I needed to, the tracks running parallel to my route the entire way like they already knew exactly where I was headed. The shack door gave easier than it should have for something supposedly unused for a season, hinges quiet, no swollen wood fighting the frame the way every other structure in this drainage fights you in winter. Inside, it didn't look abandoned. It looked paused. Supplies stacked on the shelf in tidy rows, a stove with kindling laid and ready, nothing chewed through by mice, nothing nested in by anything at all, which at 9,000 feet, in a structure left standing through multiple winters, is its own kind of wrong. Animals use shelter. Boys. This shack had been left strictly alone. I found the logbook on a shelf near the stove, government issued, The same kind I carry myself, spine cracked from handling. Halvorson's name was inked on the inside cover in block letters. The early entries read exactly like mine. Weather, frequencies, routine collar checks, dry and procedural. Then, maybe 2/3 through, the handwriting started changing, tighter, faster, words crammed against the margin like he'd stopped trusting himself to have enough pages left to finish a thought. Strides 61 inches again. Consistent 4th day running. No variance. Confirmed not injury-related. Collar receiver picked up frequency match to 151.460. That's not my wolf's collar. That's not anyone's collar. Log shows no transmitter assigned to that exact frequency in this district. Then, near the end, repeated 3 separate times across 3 separate entries, almost word for word each time. It doesn't hold shape in real daylight. Only shadow and dusk. Confirmed 3 times now. Full sun and it's gone like it was never there. The final legible entry was dated almost 2 years back to the day. Short, almost calm compared to the entries before it. Leaving extra flares here. For whoever comes next. I sat with that one for a long time. Because I'd never had a good answer for why I started overpacking flares 2 seasons ago, double what regulation requires, a habit I'd built without ever once deciding to build it. I'd assumed it was just caution, the kind every field tracker accumulates without examining too closely. It wasn't a warning. It was an answer I hadn't known I was already carrying. Full sun and it's gone like it was never there. I needed to know if that held up, needed it the way you need oxygen once you realize you've been holding your breath, so I stepped back outside into a sky that had gone the color of wet ash, sun already dropped behind the western ridgeline, no real daylight left to test against at all. And there, maybe 40 yards off, closer to the shack than it had any right to be given how slowly I'd walked that last stretch, sat the tracks again. Same spacing. Same shallow press into the snow. 40 yards. Not the half-mile I'd left them behind at. I hadn't heard a single footstep close that distance. I was still standing in that doorway, doing math on 40 yards I couldn't explain, when my receiver pinged clean. 151.220, my wolf. The first real signal of that frequency in 3 weeks of silence, strong and steady, no skip, no stutter, exactly the kind of ping I've trained myself to trust without question for 11 years. And here's the thing about that trust, it didn't ask my fear for permission before it kicked in. A live collar means a living animal. A pack regrouping at dusk means numbers, means another set of eyes and ears that aren't human but are still, in their own way, allies I'd spent years earning. It meant higher ground too, a ridge to the northeast where I might finally get enough elevation to punch a signal back to dispatch. I told myself that's all this was. Data. The one piece of hard data I'd had all day that fit a frame I understood. So I moved toward it, fast. Headlamps finally clicked on against light that had gone from gray to almost nothing, snow squeaking under boots that wanted to run and weren't quite letting themselves yet. The signal held steady the whole way in, never wavering, walking me straight up a drainage I half recognized from a collar deployment 2 seasons back. Good sign, I told myself. Real wolves don't hold a frequency that clean unless they're stationary, resting, safe. I found him at the coordinate exactly where the receiver said he'd be. Lying in the snow. Collar still pulsing that same clean signal against fur gone stiff with frost, body undisturbed, no scavenger marks, no drag trail, nothing, which told me almost as much as the stillness did. He'd been dead for days. Long enough that the cold had locked him into the position he'd died in. A dead animal's collar doesn't transmit like that. Doesn't hold a perfect, strong signal for 3 weeks of silence, and then snap on the instant I needed something to trust. I crouched beside him anyway, glove pressed flat against frozen fur, some old instinct refusing to just leave him there without confirming it myself, and the signal kept pulsing the entire time, steady, patient, coming from a transmitter that had no business broadcasting anything at all. Every explanation I'd built that day collapsed at once, standing right there. Not interference. Not equipment. Not an injured bear. Not a phantom glitch dispatch could write off with a form. Something had used a dead wolf's frequency, walked me a mile up a darkening drainage on a signal that was never really his, for reasons I didn't have any framework left to guess at. I stood up slowly, breath coming fast and shallow now, headlamp beam shaking just slightly across the snow. The receiver pinged again. Same frequency. Same clean, steady signal. Coming from a completely different direction than the body in front of me. Closer. I didn't run. I want that on record, whatever this record turns out to mean to anyone. I moved with purpose, toward the only high ground I could place in the dark, because that's what 11 years trains you to do even when every other part of you is screaming. The radio gave me nothing now. Not static, not hiss, just the flat dead weight of a unit transmitting into a void. My GPS marker had stopped pretending to track anything real at all, frozen on a point a quarter mile behind where I actually stood. So I climbed by feel and headlamp alone, snowing up past my knees in places, lungs burning thin air, until the slope leveled into a small open shelf of rock and scrub. I turned to get my bearings. Tracks. All around me. Not behind me. Not ahead of me. Around. A ring. Perfect spacing, 61 inches between each print, identical depth, identical pressure, circling my position completely, and no trail leading in. No line of approach from any direction. Just a closed loop, as if the tracks had started existing in a circle rather than walking into one. No. Think like you trained. Stride length. Pressure. Spacing. I couldn't. The technical voice that had carried me all day, the one that measured and cataloged and stayed calm through every single impossible thing, went quiet for the first time, and underneath it was just noise. Cold. Heartbeat. Breath too loud in my own ears. It's a circle. It's a closed circle. There's no way in. I yanked my sleeve back to check the time, hands shaking too hard to read the dial clean on the first try. 5:51. True dawn, actual sunrise, the kind that matched the logbook's words. Full sun and it's gone like it was never there, sat at roughly 6:31 that time of year in this drainage. 40 minutes. 40 minutes I did not have. Not against a ring already closed around me, already tightening, I was almost sure of it now. The spacing between prints on the downhill side noticeably shorter than the ones still uphill. My hand found the flare gun before my mind had finished catching up to why. Twice the regulation. I'd never explained that to anyone, not even myself, not in 2 full seasons of carrying extra weight nobody required me to carry. 6 flares. Magnesium, full burn, rated bright enough to be seen for miles in clear air. Halvorson's logbook had never finished that sentence. Confirmed 3 times now, full sun and it's gone. He'd never written down what to do with that knowledge in the dark, only that he'd known it, only that he'd left flares behind for whoever came next. I was whoever came next. 6 flares. 40 minutes I didn't have. I had exactly enough light in my hands to try something he never got the chance to. I made myself stop shaking long enough to think, because the next decision had to come from training, not panic. Magnesium flares burn at roughly 5,500 Kelvin. I knew that number the way I know stride formulas, filed away from some equipment briefing years back and never once useful until this exact moment. 5,500 kelvin sits close enough to true daylight that the human eye barely registers the difference. If this thing's one confirmed weakness was real sunlight, full spectrum, full intensity, then the question wasn't whether it could tell the difference between the sun and a flare. The question was whether it even had a way to check. I didn't run for the trees. Every instinct built by years of predicting wolfpack ambush geometry was screaming the opposite of what my legs wanted to do, and for once I listened to the training instead of the fear, because I know exactly how packs corner prey. They want cover, blind angles, tight spaces where a target can't see them coming from more than one direction at once. I'd used that knowledge 100 times to predict where livestock would get hit, so I used it in reverse. I scanned the shelf of rock for the widest open sightline I could find, the one spot with the fewest blind angles, the place a predator would least want to commit to. I moved there. Tracks tightening behind me the entire way, spacing shrinking, 61 inches collapsing toward something smaller I refused to measure. I dropped my pack, pulled the first flare, and didn't aim it outward toward the treeline like every survival instinct demanded. I aimed down, close, at my own position. If it needed darkness to hold shape, then fleeing toward better cover was exactly backward. The cover was the danger. The open ground, lit, was the one place left it might not be able to follow me into. The first flare hissed and caught, white-hot, the kind of brightness that punches an afterimage straight through your eyelids even when you're not looking directly at it. I planted it in the snow at my left, popped the second, planted it at my right, working a rough circle the same way I'd have stamped my own resignation if I'd had less than 6 flares to work with and a closing ring of tracks to answer. 6. A ring of false daylight, burning against true darkness, and for one suspended second nothing happened at all and I thought I'd misjudged everything, spent every flare I had on a theory built from a dead man's handwriting and nothing else. Then the air at the edge of that light did something air isn't supposed to do. It rippled. Not heat shimmer, not snowfall catching the glow, something with shape, something that had been holding itself together in the dark the whole time, suddenly unable to keep its outline steady where the magnesium light hit it directly. It didn't burn. It didn't scream. It simply lost the argument with its own coherence, edges smearing like wet ink dragged sideways, and pulled back from the light the way your hand pulls back from a stove before your brain even finishes registering heat. It retreated exactly the way Halvorson's last working theory said it would. Not destroyed. Repelled. Folding itself back into the tree-lean shadow at the edge of my circle of light, gone the instant it crossed back into true darkness, the same vanishing act he'd confirmed 3 times and never lived long enough to explain past those 4 words. I stood inside that ring of dying flares for what felt like an hour and was probably closer to 20 minutes, watching the eastern sky behind the ridge change from black to the dull gray that comes right before real light, then finally, to the pale gold of true sunrise breaking clean over the basin. The tracks were still there when full light hit them. By the time I'd walked close enough to look, they weren't. The report I filed was 3 paragraphs long, and every sentence in it was technically true while somehow telling none of it. Disorientation in low visibility conditions. Possible mountain lion encounter accounting for the irregular track sign. Equipment malfunction affecting GPS and radio reliability throughout the latter half of the assignment. My supervisor read it, nodded, asked if I needed a few days before my next sweep, and signed off without a single follow-up question, the exact same vague, frictionless language I now suspect sits in a filing cabinet somewhere under Halvorson's name too, closing his file just as cleanly as mine got closed. I didn't correct anyone. I'm not sure what I would have corrected it to. What changed is smaller than people probably expect, and harder to undo. I don't schedule fieldwork past early afternoon anymore, full stop, regardless of how urgent a call-out sounds or how much daylight the calendar claims I should still have left. My supervisor stopped asking why. I think, on some level he doesn't examine too closely either. He's decided not to need an answer. And I've started doing something I never planned and never logged anywhere officially. Every remote shelter I pass through now, every line shack and trail cache across 3 districts, gets a few extra flares left behind, tucked somewhere obvious enough that whoever finds them will know to look twice. I never decided to start that habit any more than I decided to overpack 2 seasons ago. It just felt necessary, the same way carrying extra weight once felt necessary before I understood why. For whoever comes next. One more thing, and I debate including it every time I sit down to write this up, but it's true, so it stays. My monitoring screen still occasionally picks up a clean signal from that drainage, always right at dusk, always on a frequency that doesn't match a single caller currently assigned anywhere in our system. I used to flag those for review. I don't check them after dark anymore. I tell myself that's just caution. But if I'm honest with you, it doesn't feel like caution. It feels like an agreement, one I have no memory of ever making, and some part of me has simply decided that's not a question worth asking out loud.